Well, y'all responded good. So. Yeah. Well, it's good to see everybody tonight. We're going to pick up tonight where we left off last week, talking about drinking. Is it okay? Is it not? And different questions we've got or heard, not necessarily that we've got, that we've heard, and we try and answer and help others, and so forth, and looking at different verses. It's the very last subject in the book, page 150. And if you remember last week when we started, we went over yayin, the Hebrew word, and oinos, the Greek word in the New Testament, to where when it's translated into English, it's always translated wine, and the context is what we have to use to determine whether it's going to be unfermented juice or whether it's going to be a fermented drink. And the context is the only way we can tell from that, not from the translation or the word itself, and due to the languages or the language used. And that's what we started out last week and looked at Old Testament examples and New Testament examples. And then we talked about Jesus' first miracle in John chapter 2 where he turned water into wine, and how that the context and the meaning of the words prevent that wine from being fermented or intoxicating wine. And we saw that evidence of that. And that's where we stopped last week. And we'll pick up at the top of that page, warning against drunkenness or commands against drunkenness. And in the process, we'll answer a couple of questions that we brought up and I wrote down at the beginning of class last week. But we'll kind of go through some verses that we're familiar with and we're used to hearing talking about drunkenness itself, which isn't always the issue in and of itself, but we'll kind of establish that first before we go into what drunkenness is or what it means or how the Bible defines or defines what is drunk. Our first verse, Proverbs 23:20, says, "Be not among winebibbers, among riotous eaters of flesh." Now, we understand a winebibber, somebody drinking wine or drinking a drink we shouldn't be drinking, but I brought this one up just for the fact that we're told not to even be among them, be hanging out with them. So if we're not even supposed to be hanging out with them, obviously we're not supposed to be drinking with them or drinking the drink that they're drinking. So we can see right off the bat just how dangerous the drinks are or the association with it. The next verse, Ecclesiastes 10:17, says, "Blessed are thou, O land, when thy king is the son of nobles and thy princes eat in due season, for strength and not for drunkenness." So we can see the fact that the king, the princes, they turn out good, they're strong when they're not doing the things they shouldn't be doing, and drunkenness is listed right there. So we're supposed to avoid that, do the things that we should be doing. Who can think of an example in the Old Testament? I should have thought of this earlier. In the Old Testament where you had one group drinking and one group didn't, and the one that didn't proved to be healthier and even looked healthier. I hope I got the right story since I didn't look it up. Daniel, that's the one I was thinking of. So Milton said it, so it must be right. So if you remember Daniel and some of the other princes that got taken from Israel, and the king wanted them all to eat a certain diet and be prepped and then be presented, and Daniel made his case and said, let us eat our way, stay away from the wine, stay away from that food and eat ours. And somehow they agreed, let them do it, and they were presented as healthier looking, and it all paid off. And it's kind of parallel to what Solomon is saying here in Ecclesiastes, that the princes turned out better when they stayed away from that kind of lifestyle. In Luke 21:34, "And take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness and cares of this life, and so that the day may come upon you unawares." So if we're living a worldly lifestyle, we're drunk a lot, or we're drinking, participating in that kind of stuff, the cares of the world are going to overtake what we're looking for, and our spiritual life is going to go away and our judgment is going to come and we're not going to be ready for it, is what we see in this verse. So the importance of not letting drunkenness overtake your life, impair your judgment, and you're not ready and living the way you should be. Romans 13:13. Let us walk honestly as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying. So obviously, don't live as a drunk. Don't be involved in drinking. Ephesians 5:18. And be not drunk with wine, wherein is excess, but be filled with the Spirit. So obviously here, be not drunk with wine. That was one of our questions, one of the common arguments of why we can drink or social drink a little bit, because we're told here not be drunk with wine where is an excess. So obviously here we understand we're not to be drunk, but we'll come back to this verse in a little while and kind of expand on what that means as far as what is drunk, and define it with the Greek and define it in secular logic or understanding, kind of a couple of different ways. And then 1 Thessalonians 5, verses 5 through 7, ye are all children of the light and the children of the day. We are not of the night nor of darkness. Therefore let us not sleep as do others, but let us watch and be sober. For they that sleep, sleep in the night, and they be drunk, are drunken in the night. So we see kind of two contrasting, children of the light, children of the dark, sober versus drunk. A lot of times when we see, when we define being sober in the secular world, we define it as someone that's not drinking, somebody that was an alcoholic, now they're struggling, and, how do they explain that they quit drinking? They said, I've been sober for X number of years. So they understand being sober means not drinking. But then when we go to the Bible and we try to define sober, people like to run to the Greek, and the definition in there leads the possibility of just meaning clear-headed and this and that, and doesn't say necessarily, depending on which Greek dictionary, doesn't necessarily say abstain from drinking. So a lot of people like to say sober doesn't mean I don't drink. So that doesn't tell you can't drink just a little bit here or a little bit there. Whereas if you look at the definition, then put it with this use in the verses, how the Holy Spirit put it in, we can see the contrast between sober and drunkenness. So we can see that it does apply. And as we'll see a little bit later tonight when we talk about the secular definition of drunkenness and drinking, we'll see that any amount of drinking impairs your judgment. More drinking impairs it more, and you've got that kind of scale. And then it depends on the person and their physiology and so forth. But in any case, any is going to impair you some. So we can see the contrast here in this verse, that definition of being sober does fit with abstaining from drinking. In 1 Peter 4:3, Peter says, for the time past of our life may suffice us to have wrought the will of the Gentiles when we walked in lasciviousness, lust, excess of wine, revelings, banquetings, and abominable idolatries. So again, we see the verbiage excess of wine, which would be a lot like Ephesians 5:18, do not be drunk, which is an excess. So we understand that fact that we can't be really drunk and somebody that even the world would define as drunk. But we'll come back to this verse just like we will Ephesians 5:18 in a little bit and expound on it some more when we look at defining drunkenness and what is drunk. So we've got some verses that talk about warnings or even commandments not to be drunk. But then we even have stronger warnings against being drunk. In 1 Corinthians 6:10, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners shall inherit the kingdom of God. So a drunk is definitely not going to be going to heaven. So we have an extreme warning there against drunkenness. And then Galatians 5:19 through 21, now the works of the flesh are manifest, which are these: adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lasciviousness, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, variance, emulations, wrath, strife, seditions, heresies, envyings, murders, drunkenness, revelings, and such like, of the which I tell you before, as I have told you in the past, that they which do such things shall not inherit the kingdom of God. So we've got drunkenness as an obvious not going to inherit the kingdom or not go to heaven. But right after drunkenness, you got revelings and such like, so things that compare to that. And then he also says, do such things. So it doesn't even have to be an exact word in this long list of sins, but anything comparable or close to drunkenness is going to keep you out of heaven. So we have to be careful with how we try to redefine words or twist verses that we see in this argument, or see in many different arguments on different subjects. We've got to understand that Paul is telling us that, things like items in this list. So we need to understand what we're doing, what we're discussing and defining. Does anyone have any questions or comments up to this point? Been kind of clear, I think, up to this point. Some examples of drunkenness. What was the example of Noah, or what was the problem with Noah when he got drunk? It's in Genesis 9, so it's obviously after the flood. The waters have receded, and they're out of the ark. All right, he got drunk and I guess fell asleep naked. And one of his sons come in and made fun of him. The other two covered him up, tried to save his embarrassment. And, of course, he cursed the one son. But we see that all occurred because he got drunk and did something he normally doesn't do. And it caused problems. And we see that the problems, and we see this in all kinds of classes on being drunk or talking about not drinking, is not only did Noah do something that embarrassed him, something out of his character, it also affected other people. His one son that made fun of him and got cursed, well, he cursed generations after that son. So even people that weren't alive yet got cursed and affected. So if we see a drunk driver go out and have a wreck and kill somebody that's innocent, that drunk driver is going to go to trial, get punished. Nowadays, maybe not get punished, but we see that person suffers for a wreck, but then you see the innocent person pass away, but that could have been someone's mom or dad, someone's kid, an innocent person. So it affects a lot of other people. So we can see the effects of drinking or being drunk and how it affects not just the person getting drunk, but other people. So it's definitely a warning against that. Nabal. In 1 Samuel 25:36, we've got Abigail and Nabal. And then Nabal had a feast in his house like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunken. Wherefore she told him nothing, less or more, until the morning light. Does anyone remember this story or event with Nabal and Abigail and King David?
Abigail outfitted David and his men when they were moving from Saul.
All right. Yes, David was fleeing from Saul, and at this time, so he had a whole bunch of men with him in his company, and they found out Nabal was having this feast, so they sent 10 messengers to ask for food and drink because they were fleeing and didn't have that means with them. And Nabal was already drunk and actually refused and then insulted the 10 messengers. So David had set in his heart that he was going to kill Nabal and his whole household. And Abigail kind of foresaw that was going to be David's attitude with it. So she went and met, and as Mike said, she brought food and stuff for David and his men. And so David kind of relented from doing that. But here, she didn't tell him anything when she got home. She waited till the next morning when he sobered up and understood what she was saying. And he was so scared because he realized what he had done while he was drunk. And he knew David and knew what David was probably going to do, had a heart attack, and basically was out of commission for 10 days and died after 10 days. So he, did something, maybe his name and the definition of his name, obviously he wasn't a person of high character, but we can see from the fear that he had the next morning, is something out of character, or he was at least smart enough not to do that. But he was drunk and did something of that nature. So again, we see the danger of drinking and drunkenness. 2 Samuel 11:13. Who remembers who Uriah is? Oops. Yes, Hittite, Bathsheba's husband. And David tries to get him drunk so he will go sleep with Bathsheba and cover up his sin. And, it just shows that everyone understood the danger or the effects of alcohol. So David is trying to use that to his advantage. It doesn't work, but, he understood the danger of it. So it's not a hidden effect of drinking and becoming drunk. In 1 Kings 16:9, Elah and his servant Zimri, captain of half his chariots, conspired against him as he was in Tirzah, drinking himself drunk in the house of Arza, steward of his house in Tirzah. And Zimri went in and smote him and killed him in the 27th year of Asa, king of Judah, and reigned in his stead. So Zimri was able to kill the king and take over. It was a revolt, and basically he did it when the king got drunk, and he took advantage of that state. And Ben-Hadad, 1 Kings 20:16, who remembers who Ben-Hadad is? All right, Ben-Hadad was a Syrian king, and he went out at noon, but he was drinking himself drunk, he and the kings, and 32 kings that helped him. And, let me cheat, Ahab, the Israel king, a prophet had come to him, told him when to go and attack, and they come out and show up. So Ben-Hadad sends drunk kings and an army out, and of course they're all killed. Ben-Hadad has to flee on a horse, and that's the only reason he lives in this chapter. A few chapters later, then another battle when he does eventually die. But we see the effect of all the kings being drunk and making bad decisions at this time. And King Ahab takes advantage of it. King Ahasuerus in Esther chapter 1. Who remembers what happened with King Ahasuerus and drinking?
He had Queen Vashti, he called for Queen Vashti to come out and dance for guests.
Right.
If I remember right.
Yes, he was having a big feast, had other high dignitaries there. They were all merry with wine, so they were all drunk. And he had them go and get the queen and bring her out because she was beautiful and wanted to show off her beauty. And of course, she refused, so he had her put away. But we see the effect of this because he was drunk at the time. And then, of course, Esther, and we know the story in the rest of the book. But we see bad decisions because of that. In Isaiah 56:12, "Come ye, say they, I will fetch wine, and we will fill ourselves with strong drink, and tomorrow shall be as this day, is much more abundant." And here is called the Watchmen of Israel, and this whole chapter is basically condemning those in Israel that should have been the watchmen, and basically describing their terrible failure of watching over the nation. And it's talking about the priests, the religious leaders, and basically they had turned to drinking, and they had turned to more worried about money instead of their religious duties and so forth. But drunkenness and drinking was involved in that. In Hosea chapter 7 and verse 5, "In the day of our king, the princes have made him sick with bottles of wine. He stretched out his hand with scorners." So the king is getting drunk, and that chapter describes him as doing things that he normally wouldn't do. He'd been doing things with, and I looked at different commentaries, and none of them can agree on what it means by he stretched out his hands with scorners, except for the fact that they all came up with different things that he wouldn't normally do, whether it was hanging out with the wrong people, bringing in women, or bringing in this and that, and doing embarrassing things for a king. So again, we see the bottles of wine and excessive drinking causing that problem. In Luke chapter 12, verse 45, with the unfaithful servant. "And if that servant say in his heart, My Lord delayeth his coming, and shall begin to beat the men servants and maidens, and to eat and drink, and to be drunken. The Lord of that servant will come in a day when he looketh not for him, and in an hour when he is not aware, and will cut him in asunder, and appoint him his portion with the unbelievers. So here we basically see someone's a faithful servant, and because time goes on, life goes on, things happen, they become unfaithful. They think their master is not coming back. And we kind of compare that with people waiting for the second coming and get caught up in this world and lose their faith. And we can see eating, drinking, being drunk, being part of that problem. People get into the worldly things around them, and that's definitely part of that problem. And then, of course, the Corinthians church in 1 Corinthians 11, starting in verse 17, Paul's condemning them for their treatment of the Lord's Supper. And he even talks about how some of them have, become drunk at the Lord's Supper instead of what it is supposed to be. So we can see the problems again with drinking and people introducing things that they shouldn't do. So we have different problems with drinking. So we have lots of examples. We have commands that obviously we're not to be drunk. And then, of course, those that are drunk are not going to inherit the kingdom of God. And then we've got examples all through the Bible. That's just 10 easy examples, but there's lots of others. So we'll go back to Ephesians 5:18, as I said, and expound on that a little bit, because that really addresses one of our questions, or was one of our questions specifically. But before we start that, does anyone have any questions or comments up to this point?
I had a good friend in college, but he was in pre-vet at that time. Tennessee didn't have a vet school, and so you had to get into Ohio State or Auburn. And they only took 15, so the competition was pretty fierce. And he kept a bottle of whiskey in his room that he just sipped on. He read an article that a drink of alcohol kills 200,000 brain cells. He threw the bottle away and didn't touch another drop because he was afraid of affecting getting into vet school.
It's amazing what things affect decisions like that. We can have all kinds of teachings telling us how it's wrong, and we do it until we, think it's going to affect us personally, and then we make a decision like that. So we do see those examples all the time. All right, when we go back to Ephesians 5:18, and be not drunk with wine wherein is excess, but be filled with the Spirit. So what does it mean, be not drunk with wine? All right, process of getting drunk. All right, if we go back to the Greek, we'll start there. So obviously, be not drunk, and it's made up of methusko. If you hadn't heard that pronunciation of the Greek word, and when we look at methusko, it says to intoxicate, to make drunk, to get drunk, become intoxicated. Strong's definition says it's a prolonged transitive form, but again, to intoxicate, be drunken. So really, that doesn't make it concrete if we stopped right there and looked at that definition, which a lot do. And a lot will argue, see, that just says drunk. I'm not drunk. I'm just at Olive Garden drinking one glass that the waitress brought. But if we go to Vine's Greek dictionary, it says to make drunk or grow drunk. It says it's an inceptive verb. You see Strong's kind of alluded to that, saying it was a transitive verb. But it says it's an inceptive verb, making the process or state expressed in number 1, which was right up above that we looked at a moment ago, that says to be drunk. But it's the process of getting drunk. So when we look at the process, what does that mean, the process of getting drunk? When does that process start? All right, with the first drink. So we like to look at the English word, not we. Many like to look at the English word, says be not drunk, and they define drunk themselves and say, well, I'm not drunk, so I'm not violating God's word. And we'll see that explanation. But if you go and look at what the words mean, it is actually the process, just starting that process. And that's what we see. And if you actually look at the definitions in Strong's and Thayer's, after you see that definition, you can see even the way they're worded, to make drunk. That's a process. But at Young's Analytical Concordance, it says that methusko means to begin to be softened. So your brain functions, your understanding or your judgment making is softened right off the bat. So it's that process again. E.W. Bullinger, who wrote lots of religious books, was a scholar in his day, and he said to grow drunk, marking the beginning of the process. So again, the same as Vine's dictionary, which says the process of getting drunk. So that first drink falls into Ephesians 5:18. Do not be drunk. And when we look at it, Don Blackwell wrote a book and it was explaining this, and he said it ought to be, or a good translation would be, and do not start to drink where is excess, but be filled with the Spirit. So don't start doing something ungodly, because that's going to lead you down the wrong way, but instead be filled with the Spirit, things that we should be doing. Yes?
Take one drink, you're one drink drunk.
Exactly. And I've heard that before and forgot it, but that's a good saying. Yes, James?
I like to go back to the days of Adam and Eve. If they were just taking a nibble of that fruit, they're both going to be cast out no matter what. So the nibble of the drink would have been sinning anyway. So basically the same thing. Think about it.
It's a good comparison. Very good. Yes, Wesley?
Drunkenness is a matter of degree. When is a person drunk?
That's
When
my
he
next.
passes out? You got that covered up?
Well,
Oh, when is one drunk? I didn't know you had that.
who determines when one's drunk?
One drunk. When he passes out, when he starts to tell the same old story over and over. Now, my dad was an alcoholic. He could be drunk talking to you, and you'd never know it. He could walk down the hallway over there far straighter, drunk, than I can sober. I mean, he was amazing. But if I was out in the yard and saw him turn into the driveway, I could tell you if he was drinking or not. Because he was a fanatic on wearing his hat a certain way, a dress hat. It had to be a certain way. And if it wasn't, he was drinking. And I knew his face color, and if it was a little redder than usual, I knew he was drinking. He could get out, talk to me, just as sober-minded as anybody you've ever talked to. But I'd know that he is under the influence. And the average person could talk to him and not even know the man was drinking. But it's a matter of degree. I remember the church in Galax, Virginia, that was in a rehab center there. And I was talking to the doctors. And the doctor says, there's one thing we've discovered. That is that no man living knows his toleration point. See, all that's based on how much you've eaten, your size, and all of that. And it varies from drink to drink. A man argued that his toleration point was 4. And I said, listen, you take one drink, it'll condemn you. And he said, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard. I said, well, you believe it? I don't believe that. I said, what's your toleration point? He said, 4. I said, what if you take number 5? Well, I'd be drunk and I'd be condemned. I said, see there? One drink will condemn you. You admitted it. Now, the question is, which drink is it?
Good point. And when we look at the fact, just as Wesley said, everyone tries to define it different. The Journal of American Medical Association in the 60s, when it wasn't argued as much, it says there is no minimum blood alcohol concentration which can be set at which there will be absolutely no effect. So right off the bat, you're affected. And then in supposed to be 2,000. Although legal limits for blood alcohol content levels have been set in most states, impairment in driving skills can occur with any amount of alcohol in the bloodstream. So they're softening the definition a little bit, but still trying to direct it towards drinking and driving. But we can still see the explanation of right off the bat, you're affected when you're drinking. It does impair you. And that's the whole purpose of understanding that. And if you think about looking at billboards, this statement here, the Department of Transportation recognizes that buzz driving is drunk driving. You know, that's a common phrase you hear a lot. People will say, as Wesley was saying, do you have to be falling over? Do you slur? You know, a lot of people say, I'm not drunk, I'm just buzzed a little bit. You know, I'm okay. Well, your judgment gets impaired, so you start saying, well, I'm not drunk, when actually you are, and you try and drive. And so we see these billboards a lot, and it'll have a state trooper, you know, holding somebody that just got arrested, and they was holding their driver's license or something, and it'll say buzz driving is drunk driving. So the world understands the problem with it. It's kind of crazy that in the church, a lot of times, we try and find a way to talk around it and try and fit in. When I taught this class the last time, somewhere else, someone waited till after class to bring this up, and I wish I would have thought of it, because I think it's a very good example, because where I work, this definitely applies. And a lot of people work in factories or at a power plant or at different places, and people go on rotation for being on call for like on the weekends or something like that. And if you're on call, the rule is normally you can't have any alcohol consumed within 4 hours, or you can't come in when you're called. Or say an emergency happens and they start calling people in for overtime. If you've been drinking, even if it's one beer or any kind of drink within 4 hours, you can't come to work because it impairs you enough that you're unsafe to work. So that right there tells you the secular world does understand it impairs you enough to make you unsafe. So to try and say that we can find excuses to work around it, whether you're drunk or not, whether it's okay or not, you know, it's kind of crazy that we have that problem. Yes, James?
I have one guy that got fired because he can't work drunk. We see it.
Yeah, we see it all the time. And, you know, to say that, you know, this isn't a problem in the church, I think Jeff got the Bible thrown at him one time over this subject of whether you can drink or not, you know, and he had to play dodgeball while he was preaching, you know, and that was an elder's wife, if I remember correctly. So, you know, it wasn't here, so, but, you know, it is a problem in the church as a whole in different places that people try and find ways to talk around or teach around verses or teach around definitions. Whereas one drink, as Howard said, you're one drink drunk. You know, it's the process. It's not, as Wesley said, you don't have to be slobbering or repeating the same story over and over. You know, it's that process. When you start, you've already violated God's law. Does anyone have any questions, comments? As Wesley says, observations up to this point or that verse?
My wife and I went out to eat one night, and lo and behold, we went into this restaurant, and they served alcohol, and sure enough, around the table, were sitting the elders, the 4 elders and their wives, all of them were taking an alcoholic beverage. And I'm a new convert, and I knew there was something wrong with that, you know. But here they set the wrong example before us, and besides, setting the example for the congregation, the worst of all, they have to be accounted out.
That's right. So we see, you know, just as those 10 examples, you know, those were big examples, most of them. Somebody died in a lot of cases, but, you know, just as Milton said, there is a lot of damage done just by drinking a little bit. And you don't think you're in that definition of drunk, but you're still causing damage. You know, one, you got to give an account to God, as he said, but again, that influence on a lot of others.
You brought up that elder's wife and Jeff. Now, before Jeff got there, Ken Brady preached there. This elder's wife had come in drunk. And Ken wanted to meet with the elders, and did, and said, we gotta do something about this problem. We can't let an elder's wife continually come in here drunk. That's sinful, it's wrong, we gotta help her, we gotta help the congregation. Well, they did something about it, finally. They fired Ken Bray. Now, rather than deal with the problem, they fired the preacher. And so the problem was still there when Jeff got there.
You didn't fix it either, did you? There you go. All right, 1 Peter 4:3, and I've got it listed different words there. If we read it just a moment ago, and it talks about we used to live one way, we walked as Gentiles, now we need to get rid of these things. In the King James Version, those things we need to get rid of are lasciviousness, lust, excess of wine, revelings, banquetings, and abominable idolatries. And I put in red the two words we're going to look at. In the New King James, the English Standard Version, I didn't look up the New American, but these two words, I think we all understand excess of wine is drunkenness or the same. So that's easy to understand. The other translations would use that word. But banquetings that I mistyped, in the other translations is translated as drinking party. So we can see, there's more to a banquet than just something to go eat and so forth. And it's described as a drinking party. And if we go to the Greek word for banquetings, it's defined as a drinking or carousing, a drinking bout or carousing, and so forth. And all three different dictionaries to define it. So we see it's an occasion to go drink. And I would say it would fit our definition of what we call social drinking, that people try to define social drinking. You go out to a dinner with coworkers and you want to drink to fit in, or your bosses aren't going to like you because you don't drink, so you're defining drunkenness as not being one drink because you're at a work function, but that would fit this banquet or a drinking party, social drinking. And it also fits our definition of one drink drunk. So we can't find our way to talk around it. Yes, David?
More so now than in the past. Companies would have Christmas parties or festivities, and there may be an open bar, but enough companies have gotten sued because they provided an environment where alcohol was available. And so instead of the individual, not just the individual being sued for having a car wreck, they could also go back against the company for basically providing that to them or making it that easy. So something to think about.
Yep. So we definitely see the problems show up all over the place, but society does not want to address it or get rid of it. And there's so much money involved, for one, they just keep expanding it, and the problem keeps getting worse.
A lot of events, buying shows we go to, people line up to pay $8 for a beer. And they will buy just one beer, and I remember growing up, guys didn't go out to drink one beer. I mean, the argument, you talk to police officers or anybody in healthcare, it's a huge issue. It's not only for themselves, but the harm, spousal abuse, child abuse, car accidents, you name it, on and on. I mean, that alone is enough to say, hey, we don't need to touch this stuff. I don't know whether a Christian could ever even argue about alcohol, period. I mean, it's just foolishness to think that we can go out and drink and everything's going to be good.
That's right. And when you look at this verse, one thing that stood out to me was that drunkenness and drinking parties, or drunkenness and social drinking, are listed separately in this verse. And it makes it two distinct items. So even if you tried to define drunkenness as being that alcoholic or somebody, the slurry talker, you've still got the social drinking as being wrong. And they're both listed independently in this verse, and that kind of stood out to me. And that's where we'll pick up next week. And we'll appreciate everybody's participation. And if you have any questions that we need to add to our list of questions or any other comment, we'll pick up right here. So if anybody has any comments on what we've talked about so far, we'll pick up with those and then continue on. Appreciate everybody's participation and being here tonight.